Good afternoon, and a pleasure from my side to welcome you once again to our In Conversation With. As we always say, this is not in presentation with, it's in conversation with. And I, for one, are really looking forward to today's conversation. We've got some really, I think, ladies, I counted I did the sums between the three of us. We have in excess of 100 years of experience on this topic. I think we can talk with kind of authority on this topic today. I'm Annamarie van der Merwe, Executive Chair at FluidRock, and it's really an honor and a pleasure for us to have you with us in the room. Corporate governance and crisis management go hand in hand. Is what we really, I think, the message that we're trying to get across, because at FluidRock, obviously, that's what we're looking for, is helping organizations to be well governed. And one aspect that can really derail an organization is a crisis, is especially a reputational crisis. Just this week, in preparation of the session, we were sharing amongst us the headlines on newspapers just this week around, an audit firm who had to take action against 9 executives in Australia for leaking confidential information. Beer company that have lost, I think, something like $25 billion in value because of their beer, an action against their beer sales because of the advertising that they used as part of their marketing tool. And so you can go on and on. And really today, in this hour that we have, we're going to try and give you some pointers at a board level and at an executive level as to what are the different things that we need to take into consideration. In my own experience, having being in boardrooms for more than 32 years, when it hits you, it's, when you get into that crisis mode and you're not prepared, it's where we often have, with our blind spots, we miss some critical elements, and it just becomes, and it builds. And what could have been dealt with quite swiftly then builds and becomes your biggest nightmare. So with me on the call, as I've said, I've got Stephanie Brown and Janine Lazarus, both of them absolutely, doing the right word, in their field. Stephanie is like myself, a lawyer by trade, has worked globally for most of her career, spent, I think, in a corporate world many years with Shell. Obviously, we know that Shell has had its own kind of share of crises and issues as well. And I think there's no better place to learn than when you're in the midst of the fire. So I think Stephanie brings that legal perspective to the discussion. And then we're really also very blessed to have somebody like Janine Lazarus with us, who's more than 38 years. Stephanie is more than 30 years. I'm more than 30 years, but I think, Janine, you're slightly ahead of the two of us. 38, nearly 40 years experience in mainstream media. She's a journalist that tells it as it is, that calls a spade, which obviously sometimes get into the face of certain people and others just love it. So, Janine, it's wonderful to have your kind of frank, open, direct approach to the reputational media side, how you manage all of that, but also considering the legal side. So that is basically where we're coming from, and looking forward to the insights that you're going to give us. So, ladies, Stephanie, we decided to kind of take Bain and one or two others as a case studies, but we're also going to talk a little bit broader. I was also making the observation just before we started that I saw, I saw a correspondence from a CEO of a large listed entity that made the point that actually this country is in crisis mode. So actually, all companies in this country currently need to kind of go into crisis mode. The external surrounding, is looking not positive, and it seems as though it's going to deteriorate even more. All right. So on that kind of very negative note, Stephanie, can you kind of brighten up the conversation? I don't know how you're going to do that with the legal, but let's see. Give it your best shot.
Thank you, Annamarie. And let me also say it's a real pleasure to be on this call with Janine. I first met Janine, I'm gonna say 15 years ago when she was taking me through my paces as a member of the leadership team at Shell when we were doing some media training with her. So it's wonderful to be able to share this platform with her and with your listeners who around sort of corporate governance, and specifically today talking about crisis management. It's an absolutely critical skill, obviously, and one that sometimes in the day-to-day, priorities and pressures of corporate, we don't always focus as much on. But I think certainly the last several years in South Africa, there's been a huge amount of businesses have experienced enormous amount of reputation crisis, and so there's a lot of rich learnings to come from that. So I wanted to lead today with the Bain crisis management. And I guess I was, having worked in the corporate world for over 20 years, I mean, I obviously, was following the Zondo Commission and state capture, as was Jean in the media, but then I read some Deep Collusion, hard to see that, but Athol Williams' book, which is a real insider account of the Bain story. And, it's very rare that you get to see that inside picture. Now, Athol Williams, he was kind of, I'm going to call him a Bain lifer. He'd been in and out of Bain for many years, but then had moved into academia in business and with a specific focus on ethics. And so I think, we've had a real sort of insider's view of, some of the real challenges that business leaders face when they're dealing with a reputation crisis. And in the case of Bain, we all know they're a management consultancy based out, headquartered in the US, and they were kind of front and center around state capture, and in particular around SARS and their relationship with Tom Moyani and also with Zuma. So it was really, and what interested me about it was, again, I think it's the perfect storm of massive legal risk and massive reputation risk. I mean, I kind of jokingly say, well, how do you value the damages you cause, with taking down the revenue authority of Africa's second biggest economy, I think most complex economy, and of course that all doesn't sit on the shoulders of one party. We know from state capture there were many people involved, but I mean, I just think that the size of the risk that had to be managed from Bain's perspective on the legal side, I mean, very important. So I think it's also so it's a fascinating case study though, because I also think they started with hard line. The senior leader decided we're managing our reputation here. Reputation risk, that's everything. And that's why they brought in Athol Williams. And that was his brief, right? He's not a lawyer, and they said, help us work through this. And I think Bain came out quickly and said, we want to do the right thing, right? Music, fantastic for reputation. And then you do see this hard shift as the narrative kind of goes on, where the lawyers get involved. And from my sitting outside, and of course, again, I'm mindful how difficult these situations are to manage for people in the moment. It looks at very much that it moved from reputation management. We're going to ride this through. We're going to manage the reputation. And then it moved to very much hard right around the sort of the legal risk. And so I guess and I got a couple of examples that I want to share with you, but as I was reading the book, I was minded of a conference that I went to. It was the general counsel for BP after the whole, I think you might remember the Macondo oil spill, huge in the Gulf of Mexico, just went on for days, months. It was horrific. Environmental damage to jobs, and of course, in the actual incident, 11 people lost their lives. So I had an opportunity to listen to the general counsel give his reflections on how BP managed that crisis afterwards. And I guess his main message was kind of not very well. That's what I remember. But, the big one that resonated with me is he said, a crisis is too important to be left to the lawyers. And, he was talking to a group of lawyers. And of course, that's why I'm sharing today with Janine Lazarus, because I think legal risk, it's always important. You need to understand your legal risk and you need to manage it as best you can. And that includes, making sure you don't want to expose your organization unnecessarily to legal risk. And you don't want to void any insurance policies. So, there is a lot of legal stuff you need to think about. But I think that if you are driving a crisis management strategy that is basically a legal risk management strategy, I think that's it. Different circumstances call for different things, but I think that's often I say 99 out of 100 times it's a pure legal strategy is not going to get you where you want to go. You might protect your legal risk, but you could lose your business before you ever get to the inside of a courtroom. And so I think the whole so that's why I thought Bain interested me from that perspective, because it felt to me like they started on we want to do the right thing to, oh my goodness, this maybe is bigger than we thought it was. The legal risk is huge. And of course, that's one of the things about managing a crisis. You don't know on day one, what else is going to come out, and moved into a very much a legal driven strategy. So that's my big message around, managing a crisis. Legal is an input, but they should not resist the temptation as a board, as a senior leader, even when you've got massive legal exposure, to let your lawyers drive that strategy. Mm-hmm. It is very important that you listen to the lawyers, and in-house counsel, you fight, you be in that room, but you also it is, at the end of the day, it is about balancing different risks. And I think sometimes it's just, the lawyers can take over, because of course legal risk is always massive and scary and out of your control, but so is reputation risk. And reputation risk can last a lot longer than legal risk, right? Legal risk at least comes to an end. Reputation risk never comes to an end. So with that, there's just a couple of slides. I just wanted to share a couple of examples of, I guess, other learnings coming out of the Bain case. And one of them that really struck me, if you go to the next slide, it's called the Bain apology. But even as a lawyer, I was shocked to read, this is at the end of the Nugent Commission into what happened in SARS. And Masani, who was the MD of the South African business, was asked, do you think you owe an apology to South Africans? And he says, why do you think so? First of all, you never sit in a hearing and answer a question with a question. Judge Nugent was, very annoyed and said, answer the question. Do you think you owe them an apology? And he said, no. And I guess, I wondered again, we don't have all of the information, and it was a very difficult situation to manage, but it just felt to me, again, is this another touch point where lawyers are managing the legal risk, but we've missed out. We've lost the other part. We haven't, the reputation management part, and the independence that I think a person like Janine as a professional can bring to an organization. Because obviously it's, you can't admit liability, and that's not your job, right? That's for lawyers. But certainly you can as a Janine, we deeply regret our involvement with SARS. We've just had a whole commission of inquiry. There's not really there's nothing that is going to change your legal risk profile by making, some sort of a statement. So, it just comes across, I'm moving into your territory, Janine, but no empathy, as Janine would say to me, and just sort of, and quite arrogant. So that was, but again, is that my question, lawyers driving the strategy, and are we missing out on the reputation management? And then the other next slide was, it's got a lot on it, so you don't really try to read it. But again, I wonder, it looked to me like this comes right from Athol Williams' book, and it's supposed to be the brief to people internally at Bain who are giving evidence or talking to third parties, right? And I look at that and I think, wow. And as a lawyer, it was interesting because I recognize much of this. I recognize these words. These are the sorts of things we do advise our our business leaders, our business people. But, you know, in this context, you know, it feels wrong again. So it's very legally driven. It reads a little bit, and now you know, it's also now public. One needs to always remember that sometimes things do become public. It reads more like a charge sheet than sort of how one, you know, should prepare for, in my view, a commission of inquiry. So one of the things not in there, so first of all, you must always tell the truth, right? And you don't volunteer information, but you need to tell the truth, and you don't want to be obstructing an inquiry. You don't want to come across as evasive. But, you know, it is just, you know, again, it very, very, very legalistic in the approach. And I think perhaps is that a lesson again around getting the right balance. So preparing important, you know, preparing statements, preparing for commissions of inquiry, preparing for any sort of an external engagement. You know, I think you need the balance. You need lawyers, and you need your reputation, your reputation managers, and you need to find the best way forward. So I think that's really what I wanted to say about, I guess, my perspective around some of the learnings that come out of the I guess Bain's experience in having to deal with you know, what was, you know, admittedly a very, very difficult crisis. And I'm sure that that many learnings for them, you know, would have come out of this experience as well. Well, and it's still ongoing, you know.
Yeah, it's not the end. Stephanie, it's kind of refreshing listening to somebody like yourself, like head of legal of a large, you know, international organization like Shell, saying, don't listen, you know, don't just listen to the lawyers. So I think that number one, you know, definitely I can see Janine has rubbed off on you. But I want to agree with you, and we'll unpack that a little bit later. But maybe let's hear, Janine, give us a bit of your view. You have dealt with this from a reputational, I don't want to use the word PR, or even word spin doctor, whatever they call those things, but you've dealt with many of these. Share with us a bit of your experience and what you think are kind of the things that work and do not work.
Okay, so Annamarie, I mean, I think first of all, you can call me a spin doctor, I have no issue with that, but you can't call me a public relations practitioner. Because a public relations practitioner is a very strategic role, but a PR practitioner's job is to work on the positive image of an organization. Now, and put that positive image across and that branding across. That's not my job as a media advisor. My job is to try and take a negative message and try and put a positive spin on it. And to pick up on what Stephanie said, and before I forget, thank you, Steffi, for letting me co-present with you, and thank you to the FluidRock ladies for this wonderful opportunity. The one thing about the truth, and have a look at who else can we quote but Winston Churchill? A lie gets halfway around the world before the truth has a chance to get its pants on. And that for me really encapsulates a reputation in the best way possible. There are a couple of things that I'd like to pick up on from the points that Stephanie was making. When I looked at the list of do's and don'ts in the Bain, for lack of a better word, manual, I saw a lot of don'ts. I saw a list, a roster of do nots, which made me feel incredibly uncomfortable. What we need to be mindful of when we are dealing with a crisis is that it's all very well for Bain or any other corporate to have a crisis management strategy or crisis plan. But I push against that as a media advisor or even a spin doctor, because a crisis there are three very definite things in life, Annamarie. You're going to pay tax, you're going to die, and somewhere in between that, you're going to face a number of crises, or perhaps just one. So you need to be mindful of how you work with a crisis. And a crisis needs agility. You need to be as flexible as you can. Yes, you can have a crisis communication plan, but it's got to allow for the flexibility of proactive or reactive comment, or or pleading the fifth, like in the US, where you decide strategically not to make any comment. But having said that, in a situation that is as heavily weighted as Bain or many of the other instances in which I've worked, and I will use those examples, a no comment is probably the worst thing. It's media training 101, because a no comment is louder than anything you could ever say. And even the executives who I have worked with and trained over the last 38 years, when they say I'm not at liberty to, it doesn't make that no comment any sweeter. It means that somebody is being evasive, ducking or diving, and money is being exchanged under the table. So that's the first thing. For me, the truth is a very fluid thing. What is the truth? You know, Annamarie and Stephanie, your truth may be entirely different to mine. Now, when I became a reporter at the tender age of 2021, I believed empirically in objectivity. I thought, in fact, I wore the medal, if you like, the hypothetical medal of objectivity on my shoulder, or on my chest, like a medal of valor. I quickly realized that objectivity is not something that any of us are born with. We're all born into this world with some kind of an agenda. So for you to ask journalists to report on a story objectively, you're barking up the wrong tree. So what you need to do is you need to ask for balance. And balance, of course, might not necessarily be balanced reportage in your favor, but you're asking for journalists to give you a chance to be able to respond, an opportunity of response. What I do need to say at this particular juncture is that a message is very, very powerful, Annamarie. A message has the power to make or break an organization. I have closed as a young reporter. I was 23 years old, working for the Sunday Times. I was their sleaze queen back when I was, 23 years old. A multinational with an operation in South Africa, their CEO made some ridiculous comment, and it was on the basis of this comment that I closed that organization's South African offices down. So that's the power of a message. And a reputation, you see, working hand in glove with an organization's legal structures is very important. But for the legal structures to lead the charge in navigating a crisis can in fact undo what they're trying to do, because you can't argue with the legalities. You can't necessarily admit to something, or perhaps you're not allowed to, because of whatever legalities, be entirely transparent. But there is a way that you massage that message, and that is my job. I've seen many a press conference led by an advocate with a CEO sitting on his left or his right-hand side, and that's exactly the wrong message to give to the media. You know, I've seen CEOs engage with critical issues that have resulted in people's death, and they've shown absolutely no empathy. I don't know, you know, we're not a British colony. We don't come from the same region as Winston Churchill does. We're truly Africans, and I don't know where these CEOs went to school, that they are devoid of empathy and of any humanity when they're engaging with issues. You don't have to admit to something. You don't have to confess to something. Those are words that are hugely tonal in the way they're expressed. But you do need somehow to connect with the issue, and to connect with it from a human perspective. So you know, to give you some of the examples that I've worked with, one of the companies that I'm talking with, and it's very much part of public knowledge right now, is Tiger Brands. The whole listeriosis issue hit Tiger Brands, and if you remember, the CEO, Lawrence McDougall, addressed a press conference with his advocate sitting, or where I was looking, the advocate was sitting on his right-hand side. He looked at his notes. He made absolutely no eye contact, or very little eye contact, with a whole press conference, a whole room full of journalists, and he said without doubt that his product, his cold meat, whatever. There was absolutely no link between the product that he was manufacturing and listeriosis. And the fact is that there was already proof that there was listeriosis in that there was no doubt that there was listeriosis linked to his product. So essentially, one could actually say that he lied. And one would ask why the advocate would allow that. Now, I'm thinking of another e-hailing service that I've worked for in the past, and I'm sure the people who are on this call will know which e-hailing service I'm talking about. There was, several years ago, a number of attacks. Women were raped, women were dumped onto the side of the road, women were even murdered. And because that e-hailing service is not headquartered in South Africa, the legal part, or the lawyers based in South Africa, were taking direction from head office, from the mothership. And the CEO, I think he was the CEO or the MD of the South African operation, was dealing with the media in a totally unempathetic fashion. While I know his lawyers were saying, don't acknowledge anything, don't say that, yes, women are attacked and viciously assaulted on our e-hailing service. He showed absolutely no empathy, and that really did huge damage to the brand. I work also with auditing and accounting firms who are dealing with reputational issues around things like Tiger Brands, Steinhoff, South African Airways. As you see, a reputational issue is like a message. It's never going to go away. It takes years, Annamarie, to build a legacy. It takes years to build a solid reputation, a reputation that speaks to integrity and speaks to moral compass. But it takes one message to destroy that reputation in an instant. And I've seen it happen over and over again.
Janine, I think there are so many examples that we can talk about out there. And while you were talking, I thought about a graph that I saw. The reality is, if you look at how kind of over the decades, the balance sheet moved, the kind of shift in balance sheets of companies where in the same, and the different graphs you see, you've got different percentages, but bottom line have the same message. A couple of decades ago, your balance sheet was made up of brick and mortar and, factories and your stock in your warehouses. Today, 90% of your value is in goodwill, is in your reputation.
Exactly.
It's become the most important asset on the balance sheet for companies.
And in fact, Annamarie, it's all very well to have a public relations practitioner, strategic PR company working on the branding and on the positive public footprint. It's very important, obviously, to have legal eagles on board, especially when the pawpaw hits the fan. But companies, industries, and I work across various sectors, they're very, very siloed in their approach. You need an external person to come in and give you a bird's eye view, an objective eye view. When you are working, you are involved in the nuts and bolts of your business on a daily basis. It's very, very hard for you to look, and I wouldn't say objectively, because I've just said that objectivity doesn't exist, but to look at things from a broad perspective and say, are we getting this wrong or are we getting this right? It takes an external service provider to come in and say, you know what? Your reputation stinks. People don't think a whole lot of you. And it's quite important to have that, to engage with somebody like that robustly. Annamarie, I find, and even now, as much as you're talking about, we're not just bricks and mortar, we're about who we are. We're more than just, our brand. We're bigger than that. I find a lot of organizations that I work with, even internationally, but more particularly locally, brands are reactive. And I look at this and I go, but you knew that the pawpaw was going to hit the fan. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know that you're treading into choppy waters. So if you know you're going to do that, why did you wait for the pawpaw to hit the fan before you, in fact, reacted? So for me, the way to deal with a crisis is there has to be agility. So you need to determine, can you proactively be on top of the message before the message is all over the public's arena? Or do you need to back off and wait to react once it starts building in the media space. We can't forget, of course, about social platforms. Once something, and this is not an era that I grew up in. I grew up in the hot metal of newsrooms. I started as a journalist on a typewriter. So this fourth industrial revolution and this artificial intelligence and social media, once something is on social media, it becomes like wildfire and it totally spins out of control. So the idea of dealing with a crisis and only putting in a crisis advisor at the last minute is exactly what not to do. I mean, social media, you need a response virtually immediately. And I'm actually dealing with something like that right now.
Yes, Stephanie, please.
I'm going to make a comment about sort of, Janine talking about the importance of getting an independent or an external perspective. And, perhaps, just a little bit about the role of boards. And I guess and my reflection on having, I guess, worked in-house for sort of over 20 years in a multinational. And, it's interesting the number of times that we would be facing an issue and people would say, yes, but you know what? We're a good company. We're good people. We've got good values. And I think it's just that people don't have, it's sort of a blind spot. If we believe in what our company does, we believe that we've got good values, and it's hard to see on the inside what we look at, how we look in the outside. And I think so, a message for boards, I guess. And it kind of twins in again, the importance of getting an independent perspective, because as a board, it's a very important position. It's but quite difficult as well, because you have an oversight role. You're not involved in the day-to-day, but I guess so my one sort of maybe piece of advice, think about sort of, how are you getting the independent advice? Is the organization getting the independent advice it needs? And I also, just to would sort of touch on Janine's point, get it early, right? Because I think that, it's often, because one of the other things I think, and interesting that if it came up in that whole Macondo oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, that there was an issue with equipment, and there was a message on the equipment that said, this is going to, essentially, something terrible is going to happen.
Exactly.
And people on it overrode that piece of equipment because, I guess one of the learnings coming out of it was that from a psychological perspective, the mind finds it very difficult to believe the worst case scenario. And I sort of think like that also applies in a crisis. People think like, oh, it's going to blow over. It's not going to be so bad. Yeah. And if it blows over, not so bad, great. You've done your job well. It's never a waste of money to sort of, deal with it quickly and upfront. So again, those couple of things, watch blind spots, your management. It's easy when you're inside to be blinded by how you see yourself and others see you differently. And also, getting on top of things very quickly.
Stephanie, that Gulf story, that was the CEO, if I remember correctly, said he was interviewed on television where he said to a journalist, I just want my life back. Do you remember?
Yes. Yeah, he was not the CEO for much longer. Yes.
And he wasn't the CEO for much longer. So the power of a message, Stephanie, like, I just want my life back. You can't erase that. It's out there, and it means that you don't have a job anymore. And that's the reality. So that's why it is absolutely critical to work on what your messages are. And there's another point that I think is important in this discussion. When you're dealing with a crisis, it's not just about going outside and playing in the traffic, because that's essentially what you're doing. You're almost in a boxing ring. You're trying to bob and weave and kind of evade getting smacked in the face. What you've got to do, first of all, is you've got to clean up your own backyard. So your messages internally have to be entirely consistent, and everybody has to sing off the same hymn sheet. I cannot tell you, Steph, how many times I've walked into boardrooms with C-suite executives where they're not all singing off the same hymn sheet. The COO may determine that this is a crisis that is kind of red alert, nuclear levels. And the head of HR may think, well, it's really going to blow over in a matter of weeks. Everybody has got to sing off the same hymn sheet. The message has to cascade down the ranks of the business, because that's where a journalist comes in and starts misquoting people. Because if the message at top level doesn't filter down I mean, I did it and I would do it again, and I could do it even now. I speak to people at the bottom rung of the organization, or somebody at who's front office who doesn't know what's going on, and there's my headline story. So it's very important when it comes to messaging to make sure that you have consistent message internally that is also being spun in the external space. But one other thing that I think is important to draw on, Steph, is that I've seen organizations handing out what they call hymn sheets, and already my eyes roll back in my head. So hymn sheets or storyboards. And the spokespeople of those organizations will learn those messages off by heart. Now, you know, my parrot can swear in different languages off by heart because I've taught him how to do that. When you're dealing with a company spokesperson, you want them to be able to take that message, yes, to be consistent about it, but to internalize it and authenticate it in the way he or she would normally talk or usually talk. Because as a journo with a fair amount of experience, I know who buys into that message and who doesn't.
Yeah, and I think if I listen, sorry, Stephanie, to this conversation, you know, I'm reminded of, I'm a big John Maxwell fan, so I'm reminded of one of his quotes that says, "Speak the truth, transparency breeds legitimacy." And it's really, you know, so what we're really saying is on this issue around legitimacy, for me, you know, that and the consistency that you're talking about, Janine, the thought that crossed my mind is, you know what, this is all about values. This is about who we are. Are your values as an organization something that you put on the wall and on your website? Or is it something that's ingrained in you, in your DNA, so that we know everything that hits us, good or bad or ugly, is dealt with within the boundaries and within the framework of our value system?
And I'm going to throw a spanner into that works, if I may. And it's going to probably be very unpopular, but it's a very important thing to consider or factor when dealing with reputational issues. Transparency, I love it when people are transparent. As a journalist, I lick my lips and I know how much damage I'm going to do to corporate reputation. I love it when people speak openly to me. It's a gift I have. It's what I was literally taught as a very young journalist. But from a crisis or a reputational management perspective, I wouldn't, as a corporate or as anybody leading a business, I would urge them not to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, because that could be very reputationally disastrous. It could be very professionally disadvantageous. I would ask them to be, and it sounds very funny, but I always tell this to my clients, to be economical with the truth. So in other words, I'm talking about little chunks of information. You don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. But if you'd like to still be in existence in 1 month, in 6 years, in whatever amount of time, you know, let the cat slightly out of the bag, share some details, you don't have to share all. And as the matter comes to fruition, so you can keep on sharing details. Annamarie, there's a 3-step plan in dealing with a crisis, and it's so simple, it's not rocket science. Instead of denying and saying, I'm not at liberty to, and no comment, I've used this in customer communications management. I've used this in media training. I've used this in crisis communication. It's a 3-step plan. I don't know if a waltz is 3 steps. I've never learned how to waltz. But okay, so a 3-step plan. So think of this. An issue happens. You connect with the issue, hand on heart, empathy. It's happened. I'm worried about it. We're aware of it. We regard it in a very serious light. We don't stand for this. Throw back to a positive track record. What has the company done in the years of existence that speaks to its values, its purpose, its mission? And then throw forward to what you're going to do about it. So in other words, we're investigating, we are sitting around a table, that kind of thing. But when you connect with an issue, this is the key. When you connect with an issue, don't stay there. Because the longer you stay with a negative, the more it literally multiplies itself in the minds of the audience. It resonates. It becomes an acid green in color. So This is the same. It's not going to get you a get out of jail free card, but this is a 3-step plan. The pawpaw hits the fan, say that it happened in the best way you can. Go back to a positive track record. Let's hope to God you have a positive track record, and go forward to what you're going to do.
And just come back to the
Stephanie,
transparency point, because you mean one of your other points was about it's important to be agile, and I'm just thinking of some examples. Certainly, Shell as a global company had the reserve scandal in the early 2000s, and it rocked the company from top to bottom, where it was found out that the reserves that we report to investors, which are very important, had not been calculated correctly. The CEO and CFO lost their jobs. But, you know, in that instance, the Davis Polk, big law firm in the US, was hired to do an investigation, full investigation. You know, and many months later, of course, it's all on the internet. We could probably look at it today, but quite frankly, it's so long and so boring. I don't even think I looked at it at the time. We all knew what had happened. So, you know, I guess it's a little bit, you know, it's quite, again, comes back to it's a very difficult situation to manage. It depends on the crisis and how you think it's going to play out. And, you know, that was a little bit my advice to boards as well. Think about, have your team thought about the worst case scenario where this could go? Because to some extent, if you do a full-on investigation, that was the strategy there. You put it out there, you're transparent. It's kind of, it was terrible, but, you know, you draw kind of a line under it that there's nothing more to come out. I don't know what your thoughts are there, Janine, but I guess it's a little bit different strokes for different folks, depends on the situation.
I mean, I'd like to use an example of an organization that I think rocked in the way they handled the crisis. This was 1992. Do you remember the Pick and Pay food scandal? Somebody
the poison.
Right, so somebody went and injected some kind of, I don't know what they did, some poison into a tin of canned fish. Sean Summers was CEO of Pick and Pay in those days, and he was so clever. He was so clever, and I was too young. I wasn't working as a media advisor at that particular point. I was still working in newsrooms. What he did is he got a letter from this person threatening to, you know, divulge or threatening to go public with the fact that he poisoned he injected poison into this product, and he was trying to extort Pick and Pay out of a large sum of money. So what Sean Summers did is he called a press conference, and he told the media and everybody that in fact this has happened. And he said he didn't know exactly what tin of fish had been affected, but he was going to recall all of the tins of fish products, and he was going to send them to the SABS for testing, which he duly did. When the results came back, he called the second press conference, and he told the media that in fact they found the tin, that the poison content was actually perfectly safe for human consumption, but they decided just to be on the safe side to get rid of everything. And then he offered a reward for any information leading to the whereabouts of this particular perpetrator. When the police made the arrest, he called a third press conference. It hit headlines, and Pick and Pay's share price went through the roof. So that's, you know, the way you deal with a crisis as a corporate or as anybody can very much set you up reputationally in future. So if you can ride the storm and you can be captain of the ship through choppy waters, and you know how to navigate the media space, you can honestly come up smelling of roses. So, you know, the no comment, the knee-jerk reaction of, well, talk to my head of corporate affairs is not going to get you a get out of jail free card. When you are engaging with a crisis, have a crisis advisor at your beck and call, have a lawyer, you know, and engage with it, run with it, because the way you deal with tough questions will very much set you up for what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, you know, in the interest of transparency, I am today a non-executive director on the board of Pick and Pay, but I so well remember, Janine, that case. And I remember, if I can wear my hat as a customer, that I actually, because I recall these huge ads in the new one full page, you know, in the newspaper, saying to customers what Pick and Pay is doing. I remember the sense that I felt of being respected as a customer, you know, by this kind. And Pick and Pay has always, I mean, one of its kind of real assets have been that it's been a trusted brand.
Yeah.
And I think to your point, that was the way it was handled definitely, really strengthened that perception of the brand, which was absolutely, I've many times said that's the case study for how to deal with a crisis for me. But if I, listening to the two of you as well, I'm sitting here thinking, because what often happens in my experience, when a crisis hits, it's not necessarily immediately kind of disastrous, but as you've both alluded to, slowly but surely, it kind of somehow it's like a fire, starts with a small little flame and the next thing the house is burning down. But when it kind of starts, you often have management saying, board, stay out of this. We've got this. We'll handle this. But the point is that they are, potentially policing their own work and managing stuff where could potentially backfire on them.
Yes.
So my question to you is if we kind of try and think of boards and give a bit of advice, and I hear you, Janine, about the agility. So you can't have kind of a one, fast-fit-all plan for when any time a crisis hits. But that the board gets involved, be in a kind of a form of a committee to say, the following, directors will meet with the CEO. He will account to them also what he's doing. And I think the other point is that they need to be the agility to say, in this case, who should be the spokesperson of the company? It could be a female non-executive director, because of the nature of the crisis. What's your views on that?
Let's have a look at centralized methods of communication and decentralized methods of communication. In 2008, I was outsourced by Eskom as the media trainer, crisis communicator. If you remember, in 2008, we first experienced rolling blackouts in Gauteng and in Cape Town. And for 3 weeks, Eskom went incommunicado. So in other words, they blacked out electricity and they blacked out all forms of communication. And their problem was they had a really bright head of corporate communications, who I don't know where he is now, but he was really brilliant. He was overseas by mistake on purpose. And I say that with a tongue firmly embedded in my cheek. He was nowhere to be found. And Eskom, there was absolutely no communication from our utility. So people were driving around, missing appointments. The country lost millions. The country probably lost billions. And nobody from Eskom was talking. And then I was pulled in to start media training all of the various business units: generation, distribution, nuclear energy, alternate energy. And the reason why I think a decentralized communication plan is such a good idea, Annamarie, especially in a brand or a business the size of Eskom, is because you can't expect one person who heads up corporate communication to be entirely equipped with the nuances and with the complexities of each business unit. So for me, you are de-risking your communication strategy if you put people in position to talk to the media who know what the hell they're talking about. So if somebody is talking about nuclear energy, he works in the field of nuclear energy, but there obviously has to be consistent messaging. I get very worried when a big brand vests all of its power of communication in one corporate communications person, because I've seen many times where the wheels come off.
Tiffany, your views on this and how, from a board perspective as well, do the board insist to get involved from day one? Do you stand back? Do you put a kind of a team together with board members, the legal people, the media people?
Yeah, I might fall a little bit back on Janine's point around our agility, but with a big proviso. And I guess one of the things this does talk to, first of all, I think boards have to be involved and they need to be informed of the strategy, and they need to have an opportunity to engage with, the CEO or the management team. But I guess the first step is, I think, we're talking about managing a reputational crisis in the moment. It is very important, I think, to have in place, well, you need it, every crisis is different, but the governance for managing a crisis should be in place. And so I think the board's first responsibility is to make sure that that exists, right? Because that's sort of your handrails that, okay, there's a crisis. How do we declare a crisis? Who says it's a crisis, right? What happens then Does everybody know what their roles are? And one of those things is who informs the board. So, and how does all of that work? So I think, again, you need to have some flexibility in there, but I think having that governance in place up front and having practiced it is really important. I have done these, crisis management trainings, and they're really hard, and they're quite, they're a scenario you go through, but I think, be able to fall back on at least some structure is important, and also lines of communication. Now, Janine, is advocating for a decentralized communication structure. And I think she's absolutely right. And I'm thinking, like, often it does default, I think, to either the CEO, the communications person, but that's one of the things you need to think about. Who is the best spokesperson? And if it's an operational issue, do you want to put someone forward who has the operational knowledge or not? And those sorts of questions, I think a board would be well placed to ask. Because again, your management team, hugely stressful, they're hugely occupied, but I think the board should be sort of kept informed, certainly on a significant crisis. And the other thing too, I think a board's responsibility, though, is because I think you've got to be careful about getting too involved, because you could distract your management team from what's, the work at hand. Is also, do they have enough resources? Now, one obvious resource is, are they getting professional reputation management advice? Depending on the size of the organization, have you got the right legal advice? Have you got, have you got all the people there who you need to support you? Or are they feeling like, what, we've got to be careful about budgets, times are tight, as a board, you've got to think about, you think bigger, right? Around what could go wrong, what is the risk, and making sure the team has enough.
Exactly.
The best example of this one that I know goes through another crisis from my working life, whereas think about it, big crisis, environmental issue, local operating management team, and they're asked by the group HR director, who was, in terms of the governance, responsible for the crisis management. Have you got everything you need? Have you got all the support? Have you got all the resources? Yes, they say. But then pushed a little harder, it's like, well, it would really be great if we had one of these fantastic machines. It's like, well, you can have one. Well, they're thinking, like, the message there is the managing team couldn't think big enough to say, hey, you know what, would really be great we have that, but we don't think we have the power to get that. It's just almost beyond the scope of our thinking as an operational unit. Whereas if you're talking about, in this example, mine is, it's potentially a global reputation crisis. It starts local, could go global. You need it, we'll stick it on a plane and we'll get it there tomorrow. And they're going, really? And I could see being that person in the management team that, we couldn't think about that. So again, board's role to be important, again, that independence, be outside, asking the questions, thinking about what could go wrong. What support do you need as a management team?
And Steph, just on the back of that, and so I'm behaving like a typical journalist, just interrupting and cutting in all the time. I'm afraid it's ingrained in my DNA.
No, we love it.
That is the agility that I was talking about, Annamarie and Steph, in the beginning, is having a look at what is likely to happen, but also having a look at what is very unlikely to happen, and what is absolutely left of center, what is definitely not going to happen, and prepare yourself for all of those scenarios. So what happens if the crisis lasts a week? What happens if it lasts a month? What happens if it lasts longer? And what happens if it spreads globally? So you've got to, so that is what crisis management is about. That's why I'm saying it's all very well to have a pretty crisis management plan in place. But then are you looking into the crystal ball? Are you agile enough? Do you have somebody at call 24/7 to help you as you navigate this crisis?
But even things like the BPCO example, he said, I'm absolutely the wrong thing, but human fatigue is real. And that's one of the things you have to manage, And so from a board perspective as well, keep an eye on your CEO, keep an eye on your team. Do they have, you can't manage a crisis for 365 days on a massive scale. People will burn out.
Oh, well, they all got to eat cheese and tomato sandwiches and ride the storm.
I want to hear from those in the room. If they've got any questions, they're very welcome to put it in the chat. We've got about 5 minutes left, so we would love to get some views and comments from people. So Jock DeBee says to Janine, thanks for a wonderful conversation. How much weight do you place on corporate running crisis simulations and drafting crisis comms playbooks? I've got a feel I know what you're going to say, but go for it.
Jacques, I know Jacques very well, and hi Jacques, it's a non-negotiable. I mean, I've run around, as you know, with a cameraman who you know very well, and we've pretended that a crisis had hit the fan. And it was amazing. All the lessons of how to deal with a crisis left that business entirely. People were talking to us on camera, shooting their mouth off. Crisis drills are so important. Have a crisis drill, a real life simulated crisis drill. Let us come in and film your employees and how they respond to it, and then let us unpack it on day 2 and see how in fact you got it wrong, because generally people do get it wrong.
Absolutely agree. And that's how I met Janine. She and her cameraman were there. Fortunately, and we are still friends.
No, I'm really impressed with that. But I think that if I can start to kind of, if we can summarize and kind of closure, unless there's any other comments from people in the room. But what we're really kind of saying is, to your point, Janine, you can't have a fixed kind of here's the book on how you deal with it, because every crisis brings its own dynamics, into the room, which could affect all of that. So that's number one. You need some structure. You shouldn't be caught off guard, because the one thing that we know is that a crisis is going to hit at some point in time. It is going to hit. So you need to be prepared, but you need to prepare in a way that you can actually deal within the context of that crisis. Definitely, on the other hand, I mean, the reality is that most of these crises definitely have a legal side to it, which you cannot ignore. We said earlier, your insurance, your fine print on your insurance policy will say you admit anything, that's it. You have no cover. But to then bring in Janine's point about the human element, the kind of empathy, the connection with people. And this is why sometimes, with all due respect to the wonderful CEOs we have out there, it's just not in their nature. They're not, that great at making that connection.
If I can use a quick example of a massive insurance organization, everybody will know who they were. There was a man who died in a hail of gunfire in a botched car hijacking. I don't know what it was. His wife tried to claim his life policy from an insurance company. The insurance company were absolutely correct legally. The victim of the crime didn't declare some medical status of his, so they really weren't obliged to pay it out. But they capitulated. They capitulated because the media took them on, and that's what happens when the media takes you on, and you are like a frightened buck facing the headlights of a media storm. You generally do capitulate. The media is very, very powerful. But what really happened was the CEO at the time was probably so overwhelmed that he didn't communicate with any kind of empathy, and it lost him. I don't know if it lost the company clients, because it's a whole number to cancel your insurance and get new insurance. But he lost a lot of public support because of the unempathetic and unsympathetic way in which he handled it. He might have been legally correct, but he didn't connect with humanity.
Now, that's a very good example. And Jock, to your point about the media being powerful, Jock kind of also asked the question. He said, do we think that the media in South Africa has the capacity to kind of ask the right questions? Are they as tough as we see them in some other countries like in Europe and the US?
No, I mean, I think we're in a relatively, we're in a young democracy. 28 years, 29 years is not a long time. I mean, there are some really brilliant journalists out there, some great investigative journalists. I mean, I can think of a number of them, but I think it's something that still is quite at its fledgling stage here, and I think it needs to grow. It needs to grow and expand.
Yeah, we should not see the media as our enemy. We should see the media as our friend. And I think we need to build those relationships, and help them, capacitate them, empower them with information, with ability to actually do, because in this country, they've played a critical role in uncovering some of the stuff that needed to be uncovered. Ladies, we've kind of run out of time, but I knew from the start we could probably go for the whole afternoon. And I regret that we only have an hour. And I'm hoping that, that we've given some nuggets to people in the room. We've got Sabine saying, Stephanie and Janine, really interesting. Thank you for that. They enjoyed it. So that's great to hear. You can leave your comments to us. But ladies, thank you so much for giving us some of your valuable time. It really was an honor to be in the room with you today and to listen to your vast experience. I enjoyed it. We will have another webinar. I think we'll regather at some point in time. But just wishing you all well. Thank you to everyone that participated, that joined us today. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to our next webinar, which I think will be. We will send out the information around that. There's some, if you want to connect with Janine or Stephanie, LinkedIn, we know by now is a great platform. And on 3rd of August, we'll be back here with body language in the boardroom, which is going to be another very interesting conversation. Thank you, ladies. Have a good afternoon, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.